Hathor, Lady of the Sky, Mistress of the Gods, she who doesn't have her equal in heaven and on earth. She was the female aspect of the sun, the most important of the Egyptian goddesses. Because classical authors such as Plutarch focused rather on the Osirian myths, the role of this complex, multifaceted goddess isn't widely known today. Once omnipresent, she occupied a central place in both popular folk religiosity and official state cult. Simple Egyptians made more votive offerings to her than to other gods. She had more temples than other goddesses. All-powerful, co-creating the universe, heavenly star goddess who regulated life cycles on earth, and at the same time the most humane of gods, lady of joy, music, sexuality. A beautiful lady to whom Egyptians directed their thoughts and prayers, whose positive and constructive power, love and tenderness, is as mighty as the power of divine anger, which she also represented. Who is Hathor? What was her relationship with other gods, with the pharaoh and the people of Egypt? Hello everyone, my name's Irena. Welcome to my channel Ancient Side Girl. I invite you to a podcast about the history of ancient Egypt. Today, I'll present to you one of the oldest and most famous goddesses of Egypt, her origins, her special role in the solar cult, in the Osirian myths, in the cult of the dead and the Egyptian folk spirituality. As usual, you will hear fragments of original ancient texts, among them fascinating, perhaps slightly disturbing mythological stories. Her name, Hathor, probably in ancient Egyptian Hathor, is usually translated as House of Horus. The Het, whose hieroglyphic symbol represents a fenced estate, may indicate a protective function. Inside this symbol is a falcon symbolizing Horus, the Egyptian Hor, or simply a king, who was in early dynastic times and probably still in the times of Khufu considered a living god, the highest of gods. It seems that Hathor was associated with royalty and the state from the very beginning. She was its protector. Other researchers see her name as a symbol of maternal protection. In the enclosure, they see the womb of the goddess, protecting the god-king. If Hathor means the mother of the king, then it's no wonder that almost all pharaohs willingly admitted to her and supported her cult. No wonder that of the countless Egyptian goddesses, Hathor seems to be the most important. She was the beloved national deity of all the Egyptians as the main form of the ancient Great Mother Goddess. Only in the late period, and especially in Greco-Roman times, she was replaced by Isis, who gradually took over her functions and positions. The cult of the Mother Goddess representing fertility wasn't only universal, but perhaps also the first. The oldest preserved cult images in the world attributed to the Mother Goddess come from the darkness of the Ice Age, 30,000 years ago. The oldest traces of this pre-religion in Egypt date back to 5500 BC. The cult also developed in the Bronze Age. In the pastoral cults of pre-dynastic Egypt, the life-giving force associated with fertility was of course recognized in cattle. The oldest found remains suggesting an attempt at artificial mummification belong to a cow and are dated to approximately 5400 BC. At a time when the Nile Valley was still partially surrounded by savannas, the cult of these animals among semi-nomads seemed obvious. Its elements survived in pharaonic Egypt in symbolism and royal titles. The pharaoh remained, the mighty bull of the grassland. His kilt was decorated with a bull's tail, and among the most important regalia was a heka-scepter that he held during the ceremonies in the shape of an original shepherd's staff and a nekhek flail, once used to prod cattle. This old pre-dynastic symbolism related to cattle breeding became popular with the emergence of the religion of Osiris at the end of the Old Kingdom, which referred to Egyptian prehistory. Shepherds' attributes crossed on their chest appeared on anthropomorphic sarcophagi of the Middle Kingdom. The oldest Egyptian cow goddess known to us, associated with fertility, motherhood, and heaven, was probably Bat, worshipped in the 7th nome of Upper Egypt, Sesheshet, near today's Kina. It was Bat who was most likely depicted on top of the famous palette of Narmer, the ruler of Thinis, who was supposed to unite the previously independent nomes in the 32nd century BC, thus founding the first dynasty of Egypt. The famous palette shows the face of a woman with cow horns and ears, a popular motif throughout ancient Egyptian history. The so-called Hathorian columns, topped with such an image depicted always facing towards, will become a symbol of Egyptian architecture, but some researchers trace their origins to the oldest known Egyptian temple in Nekhen, a city called Hierakonpolis by the Greeks. This great temple, built of wood and reed mats, may have been hundreds of years older than Narmer, and in its vast courtyard there were tall poles with cow heads on the top. As for Bat, however, it's possible that she was one of many cow goddesses worshipped in various nomes, identified with the equally primeval Hathor, as was the case with other gods, falcons, and several deities associated with the funerary cult worshipped in the form of a jackal. Over time, numerous bovine goddesses were included in the powerful national cult of the patroness of the 6th nome of Upper Egypt, Hathor. There are other goddesses imagined or represented by cows, such as Nut, the goddess of the celestial vault, belonging to the 2nd generation of the Ennead, and as the celestial cow, known from solar myth, she was associated with Hathor. Mehet Weret, the Great Flood, is another ancient goddess imagined as a sitting cow with a solar disk between her horns. Just like Nut, she's a solar goddess identified with the Milky Way, and just like Nut, gives birth to the sun, but she was supposed to do this at the very beginning of creation. As her name, Mehet Weret, suggests, she caused the Nile to flood every year. Of course, she was closely associated with Hathor, who was worshipped as the one who brings the floods of the Nile and controls the agricultural cycle. A Ptolemaic inscription from her temple at Dendera reads, "You cause the flood flowing downriver in its season, an appropriate flood, devoid of calamities, in order to make it spread over both lands. You cause the sky to bring forth the northern wind in the next season, to make the flood flow back upstream and prevent the waves of the sea from engulfing it too soon. You cause the Mediterranean to receive it on the appropriate day without its course being held up any longer." The Egyptians who closely observed nature saw in conception, pregnancy, and childbirth the paradigms on which they based their ideas about the creation of the universe, gods and people. Hence, the female aspect of each of the gods was indispensable. Since the first creator god, Atum, performed the act of creation alone, sprinkling his seeds on the surface of the cosmic ocean Nun, his hand was considered the female aspect of the creator, and was personified by Hathor. The allegory of creation that was comprehensible to the Egyptians was the capable of procreation heavenly cow, emerging from the primeval waters, with the sun rising between her horns. Her body was often decorated with stars. Until Roman times, cow goddesses associated with fertility and the heavens were depicted in this way: Nut, Mehet Weret, Neith, Isis, and above all, Hathor, mistress of the stars. The age of the pyramids and the flourishing of the solar cult marked the consolidation of Hathor's position as a significant deity, the female aspect of Ra, and also the Eye of Ra, as she is described in the pyramid texts. As the heavenly mother of the pharaoh, she was considered the mother of Horus, but over time, as the cult of Osiris developed, she would become his wife. However, her original role will survive in the consciousness of the Egyptians. The figure of a cow breastfeeding the king was a popular motif in pharaonic art. By feeding the king, she was of course feeding the whole country. The first textual mention of Hathor was found in Giza, on the facade of Khafre's Valley Temple. Khafre, beloved of Hathor. This short text clearly indicates a state cult. It was then that the notion of her appearance was formed. Because she has served so many different functions over the thousands of years, her depictions often differ significantly. However, there are several basic patterns according to which she was depicted in Egyptian art. We most often admire her in her anthropomorphic form, as a young, attractive woman wearing a sun disk flanked by the cow's horns on her head. This is her characteristic crown, although she was sometimes shown with a crown with 2 feathers adorned with sun disk. Hathor sits on a throne or stands holding a papyrus scepter, or the was scepter, which is rather typical of male deities. Sometimes called Lady of the Red Cloth, hence she was most often depicted in a red dress. This is the color of the lion-headed Sekhmet, which she became on the orders of the sun god to wreak havoc and drink human blood. Perhaps the color of the dress refers to another title, Lady of the Red Land, as she ruled over all the deserts surrounding the Black Land, the Nile Valley. She was also often depicted as a mother goddess breastfeeding. Another of her characteristic images is the so-called the Hathor head, a frontal depiction of a woman with cow ears, which was a popular decoration of the capitals of columns in Egyptian temples, but also of paintings referring to sacral architecture. Hathor's head also adorns Egyptian sistrum, an instrument inextricably linked to her cult. The sound of the sistrum calms and amuses the goddess. It's the best tool to appease her. Of course, her oldest and most popular zoomorphic form is a cow wearing a solar disk on her head. An intermediate form is a woman with a cow's head. Hathor, imagined as the Eye of Ra, her terrifying and destructive alter ego, is usually the lioness Sekhmet, the cobra Wadjet, or the solar disk surrounded by a uraeus. The flourishing of her cult happened during the apogee of the solar cult in Egypt during the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, the age of the pyramids. King Menkaure from the 26th century BC seems to have had a special relationship with Hathor, mistress of the 2 lands. It was under his rule that the rank of her cult increased, and he was also to establish a new priesthood for Hathor. Menkaure placed the goddess on his royal seal and titled himself as Beloved of Hathor. The discovery in the Valley Temple of his pyramid complex at Giza of the famous greyworky statues of the so-called Triad of Menkaure show him between Hathor and the personifications of important Egyptian gnomes. The pharaoh portrayed himself as the lord of individual regions, his authority legitimized by Hathor standing at his right and holding his hand, of course with the face of his royal wife and sister, Kamerernepti II. The mythological Hathor could be both the mother and the wife of a king. She was therefore associated with the women of the royal family. She was the ideal archetype, the divine model to which royal mothers and wives appealed. In the Middle Kingdom, there was an increase in the position of royal consorts. Queens were seen as earthly incarnations of the goddess Hathor, as mothers, daughters, or wives of the sun god. At this time, portraits of queens wearing characteristically heavy Hathor wigs appeared. What's more, they were adorned for the first time with uraeuses, previously reserved exclusively for the pharaoh. Of course, the uraeus, the cobra guarding the royal crown, symbolized the Eye of Ra, a powerful weapon in the fight against evil, against the enemies of Maat. The destructive power of the eye, called Wadjet or Sekhmet, was commonly identified with Hathor. So the cult expanded in the Middle Kingdom. Its first ruler, the famous pharaoh of the 11th dynasty, Mentuhotep II from the 21st century BC, who reunited Egypt, dedicated the Theban necropolis to Hathor, on which he built his magnificent temple at Der el-Bahri, where 500 years later there would stand a larger and even more magnificent temple of Hatshepsut, the famous female pharaoh of the 18th dynasty of the New Kingdom, who considered herself the true daughter of Amun and Hathor, whom she made the patroness of her reign. From the end of the 13th century BC, the Ramessids reached for primeval, proven religious traditions to more effectively distance themselves from the Amarna heresy and legitimize the rule of their own dynasty. They naturally focused on the solar cult and its great goddess Hathor. It's not difficult to imagine how popular this cult must have been both on a local and national level, since these powerful rulers so willingly resorted to it to legitimize their rule. According to solar theology, the sacred river Nile has its sources in the heavens, and as we already know, its floods are the merit of Hathor, so she's the lady of the harvest, she's the one thanks to whom the seeds sprout, and who brings abundance to all Egypt. She's the heavenly nurse and the lady of the year. We can even find traces of this common Egyptian notion in the Bible. In the story of Joseph, known from the book of Genesis, the 7 cows, plump and attractive. From Pharaoh's dream, the prophet Joseph interpreted as, quote, 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. And this is nothing other than Hathorian theology. Part of the New Year's ceremonies in Dendera, in the main sanctuary of Hathor, the pharaoh addressed litanies to good year, Hathor Mut. Part of the ceremony was the renunciation of the 7 arrows of Sekhmet, which are omens of misfortunes that can be compared to those described in the Bible. And behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile, and the ugly thin cows ate up the 7 attractive plump cows. Some researchers even believe that the famous golden calf created by Aaron and worshipped by the Hebrews during Moses' unexpectedly long absence was in fact an image of the goddess Hathor. In the book of Exodus, they avoid calling him a bull, which could point to Apis. By the way, Apis wasn't at all a popular choice of Egyptian sculptors creating cult figures. He was, after all, a living image of himself, a reincarnated Ptah Osiris. Statues of Hathor, however, were instead extremely popular. She was titled Golden Goddess, or sometimes Golden Cow. The term calf could therefore be a mockery, proving the stupidity of the faithless. Finally, the image of the idol may have been so small that it was described simply as a calf. The cult of Hathor, the mother goddess, in the form of a cow, as universal and extremely popular in Egypt, from which the Hebrews departed, must have been well known to them. Moreover, it took place in Sinai, the land over which Hathor was the patron. As we know, despite the wealth of myths written down from the Old Kingdom to Roman times, the Egyptians never created their general canonical form, so we have different versions of the same mythical stories that differ depending on when and in what region they were written. Extremely contradictory events, a multitude of threads, variants and various deities who sometimes play not one, but several roles in one myth. All this may make a modern reader feel dizzy, but for the Egyptians it was normal that the action of the myth resembled dreams, and just as in a dream, the version of events is never identical. Their heroes change their appearance, name, or role. For example, in the Book of the Heavenly Cow, we learn about Hathor, the beautiful and gentle daughter of the sun. And at the same time, cruel and brutally annihilating humanity, Hathor Sekhmet, who is the destructive weapon of her father. She is the Eye of Ra. If you're interested in this story, check out my podcast on Sekhmet. If we try to look at reality through the eyes of the ancient Egyptians, recognizing that each deity is only an aspect of one living cosmic being, the great creator god, then these contradictions won't bother us so much. Although Hathor was a primeval, probably pre-dynastic goddess, she was quite commonly described in myths as the daughter of amun-ra, hence she was generally identified with the first female being, the goddess of moisture, Tefnut, who according to the Heliopolitan theologians of the Old Kingdom belonged to the first generation of gods. Together with her brother Shu, the god of air, she was born from Atum at the very beginning of Zeb Tepi, the first time. While Tefnut, the mother of the gods, in the famous myth of the returning goddess, was the lion-headed Sekhmet, fierce in pursuing and destroying evil, the cheerful, gentle face of the returning goddess was often associated with Hathor. In the popular version of the myth, the rebellious Tefnut, at the instigation of the divine mediator Thoth, returns from distant Nubia to Memphis as the Golden One, Hathor, the Lady of Sycamore, the beautiful and powerful goddess of all joy. The action of the myth takes place in earliest times, when the gods still lived on earth, and Ra, jubilant at the sight of his beloved daughter, cried with joy, and his tears gave birth to the human race. In one of the Ptolemaic papyri, the Bremner Rind, we read, "I wept. That is how humans came into being from the tears which came forth from my eye." Interestingly, the words tears and humans sounded almost identical in the ancient Egyptian language. The return of the goddess is the end of the crisis caused by her absence, the return of mud to Egypt, the return of the floods of the Nile. The sun god himself was to initiate a great festival in her honor. Ptolemaic inscriptions from the temple at Dendera describe this wonderful moment. How beautiful is your face! You appear in your sanctuary, Hathor the Great, Eye of Ra. You go out in procession, Lady of Light, who repels the darkness. You have brightened the two lands with your beauty. Ra himself is praising you, making adoration before your beautiful face. The gods are making adoration for you. The goddesses are making jubilation for you. The sky and the stars are rejoicing for you as you go forth from the horizon. The entire land praises you as far as the rising and the settings of the Aten. Millions open their arms for you. Hundreds of thousands kiss the ground for you. The king of Upper and Lower Egypt has come before you, Hathor, Lady of Unet. He makes this beautiful festival for you. He repeats it annually for eternity. While the early dynastic Hathor was considered the mother of Horus, in the Osirian myths they were made into a pair. But this is also a different Horus, not the all-powerful Lord of Heaven, but a young, fledged prince whom she must support in his rather inept efforts to gain the throne. I often quoted in my podcast the mythological story known as the Contendings of Horus and Seth from the so-called Chester Beatty Papyrus I, the Ramessid period, 12th century BC. It tells about the clash of these two gods fighting for the throne of the deceased Osiris, who, as we know, was fratricidally killed by Seth and sat on the throne of Duat, the kingdom of the dead. According to the text, one of Horus's most powerful supporters was Hathor, who once again rebels against her own father. As we already know, Ra remained an ally of the cruel Seth until the end, as Seth was his companion on his nocturnal journeys through the land of the dead, during which Seth defended the solar bark against demons. When most of the gods of the Great Ennead, as well as the powerful mother goddess Neith, supported Horus's right to the throne, the outrage to Ra responded with insults against the son of Osiris. Quote, "You are despicable in your person, and this office is too much for you, you lad, the flavor of whose mouth is bad." This attack was met with outrage by the rest of the gods, who shouted at the great Ra, "Get out! This offense that you have committed is exceedingly great." The behavior of the highest god and the lack of discipline among his divine court may be surprising, but one should remember the specific circumstances of the described events. The fratricide and usurper Seth, on the earthly throne of Osiris, is a disturbance for the first time in the history of the divine and cosmic order, Mat. The atrocities of his rule caused widespread chaos, also among the oldest gods. Order and balance will be restored only after Horus regains the throne of Osiris. According to the text, offended and resigned Ra seems to have fallen into depression. Quote, "And so the great god spent a day lying on his back in his pavilion, very much saddened and alone by himself. Unexpectedly, Hathor herself intervenes, and this is definitely one of the most controversial fragments of the story. Let's listen. After a long while, Hathor, lady of the southern sycamore, came and stood before her father, the universal lord, and she exposed her private parts before his very eyes. Thereupon the great god laughed at her. Then he got up and sat down with the great Ennead. He said to Horus and Seth, "Speak for yourselves." What is this really about? Why did the goddess's exposure make her father laugh? Does this have anything to do with the divine incest present in Egyptian texts? It's worth recalling that almost all of the oldest gods, the so-called Great Ennead, were spouses of their own siblings. However, perhaps this act refers to the ritual exposure of women, for example, before the Memphite god Apis, who similarly like Ra also represented the great creator god, Ptah in this case. We also know about the quite common practice of lifting up the skirt among faithful female pilgrims during religious festivals. This was mainly related to the cults of female deities, fertility and solar goddesses, such as of course Hathor, Bastet or Isis. The ritual exposure of Egyptian women was therefore an element of worship, a practice probably derived from folk religiosity. Already at the turn of the New Kingdom, it must have become deeply rooted in the general consciousness, hence its presence in religious texts. But why did Ra laugh when he saw his naked daughter in front of him? Perhaps it was simply about the element of surprise and the absurdity of the situation. Nevertheless, Hathor's attempt was successful, and Ra returned to settle the dispute over the throne of Osiris. The same text describes the confrontations between rivals. When they fight underwater in the form of hippopotami, Isis unexpectedly stops her son from striking a fatal blow to Seth, for which Horus decapitates his mother in a frenzy. Then, to hide from the anger of the gods, he hides in the desert, where he is found by Seth, who removes his 2 eyes from their sockets. Then we read, Seth came away and told Rahorakti falsely, I did not find Horus, although he had found him. Then Hathor, mistress of the southern sycamore, set out, and she found Horus lying weeping in the desert. She captured a gazelle and milked it. She said to Horus, Open your eyes, that I may put this milk in them. Then he opened his eyes, and she put the milk in them, putting some in the right one and putting some in the left one. She told him, Open your eyes, and he opened his eyes. She looked at them and found that they were healed. She set out to tell Rahorakti, I found Horus after Seth has deprived him of his eyes, but I have restored him back to health. See, he has returned. So it's Hathor who reverses the fate of Horus, who has just suffered his greatest defeat. The goddess cures his blindness and reveals the truth about Seth's crime before the tribunal of the gods. Soon there is reconciliation with Isis, miraculously cured by Thoth, and ultimately Horus is victorious over Seth. The Ennead entrusts him with the throne of Osiris. Hathor sits at his side as a divine wife. With the emergence of the cult of Osiris in the 24th century BC, Hathor began to function also as a funerary deity. The first intermediate period, or the collapse of central authority over Egypt in the 22nd century BC, brought the popularization of religious funeral texts, previously reserved exclusively for the pharaoh. The new popular religion of Osiris brought the promise of salvation for ordinary people, which was to be aided by guides to the afterlife and spells written on coffins. This is when the coffin texts appear, slightly modified and enriched with new concepts, manuals that were to facilitate the soul's journey through the afterlife. The soul of a person who didn't belong to the exclusive divine club of kings. Ordinary people needed additional support after death, a mediator between them and the gods. It's in this role that Hathor herself appears. Rarely mentioned in the pyramid texts, she becomes an inseparable element of Middle Kingdom funerary beliefs. The Lady of Heaven, the primeval lady of all, becomes a somewhat more earthly goddess of ordinary people. She is a tender caregiver, clothes and feeds the dead as a merciful intercessor. Quote, "May Hathor extend her arms to me. I am her scribe whom she loves, who does what she desires every day. I have come to play music for her, to play music for her. I have come to offer bread to Ra-Atum and to institute offerings for Hathor." In Ramessid times, the times of the great renaissance of the solar cult, and when the ruler's salvation depended on the success of the nocturnal journey of the dead sun, Osiris-Ra, Hathor was often placed aboard his solar bark, the lady who strides out in the bark of millions of years. The goddess thus fulfills her traditional role of protecting the sun from demons. She is the Eye of Ra. Some texts suggest that she is not only a crew member, but also steers the solar bark in the afterlife. "Being in the company of Hathor, I will eat of fish and fowl, and of secret things which are on the ground. I traverse and stride through the circuit. I traverse the firmament. I climbed the sunlight in the company of Hathor. I am the seated one, the son of Atum. My writings are in the 2 fields of offerings of Hathor. This gate which Hathor has made is open. The 3rd of the gates of Ra is thrown open. How perfect! Would that I were there. May I be there in the retinue." During the New Kingdom, it was commonly believed that after leaving the tomb, the soul flew to the western desert, following the sun. It was a very long journey, so the deceased had to rest in a mythical oasis, where Hathor welcomed him in the shade of a sprawling sycamore tree. The goddess also provided him with bread and beer, so that he could continue his dangerous journey westward. In the Book of the Dead we read, "I will live upon that whereon live the gods and the spirit souls. I shall live, and I shall be master of their cakes. I am master of them, and I shall eat them under the trees of the dweller in the house of Hathor, my lady." Plants were also attributed to Hathor. 2 trees in particular were associated with her cult, the date palm and the sycamore. As the lady of the date palm, she was the protector of the dead, because date palm wine was used to wash the internal organs of a mummified person. As the lady of the southern sycamore, she was a patroness of lovers, who often took refuge in the shade of this sprawling tree. But more about that later. Egyptian New Kingdom tombs are often decorated with images of Hathor emerging from the crown of a tree, with a solar disk between her horns, or with fruit on her head. In this form she was identified with the sky goddess Nut as the lady of the sycamore tree or the tree goddess. She greets and feeds those entering the Duat, land of the dead, kind of through her divine garden, just as the dying sun flows into the underworld through the mouth of the goddess Nut. Hathor, as a funeral deity, had a special position in Thebes, the capital of the Middle Kingdom and the Thutmosids of the 18th dynasty. As Mistress of the West, she was the patroness of the sacred royal necropolis of Western Thebes. The necropolis itself was depicted in art as a red mountain, from behind which the goddess emerged in the form of a cow, a popular decorative motif of Theban tombs. Of course, Hathor was not the sole guardian of the necropolis. It was also protected by the deified king of the 18th dynasty, Amenhotep I, and his mother, Ahmose Nefertari, but above all, the cobra goddess Meretseger, who was supposed to live on the top of the hill of the natural pyramid Ta Dechend, at the foot of which is the Valley of the Kings. In the New Kingdom, it was believed that somewhere at the top was one of the entrances to the duat, the authentic gateway to the afterlife. Hathor had several chapels in western Thebes, a temple at Deir el-Medina, and above all, a beautiful chapel in the magnificent mortuary temple of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahri. The temple was called Djeser Djeseru, the Holy of Holies, and was actually dedicated to Hathor. Once a year, in the second month of Shem, today mid-May, a festival of the dead called the Beautiful Feast of the Valley was celebrated here. It lasted several days, during which the sacred statue of the supreme deity of the New Kingdom, Amun-ra, sailed from Karnak on its bark to, through the Nile, reach the western bank, and then unite with the Lady of the West in the temple of Hatshepsut, blessing the dead along the way. Thebans followed the sacred bark, bringing flowers and offerings, as well as food and drink for themselves. Once a year, the cemeteries became a vibrant place of feasting and ritual drinking. Entire families spent the evening in the cult chapels over the graves of their ancestors. The statue of Amun spent the night in Deir el-Bahri, and the next day visited other mortuary temples of western Thebes. In the Theban tombs of the New Kingdom, Hathor was also titled Chieftainess of the Desert Necropolis, Chieftainess of Thebes, and a Lady of Amentet. Amentet or Imentet is a goddess often mentioned in the Book of the Dead, representing the necropolises of Egypt located west of the Nile. Amentet must have been extremely popular in Thebes. During my travels around western Thebes, I often came across her characteristic image. The goddess of western cemeteries was depicted with the hieroglyph emblem of the West on her head. It's a complex symbol, contains among others the figure of a hawk and a feather, which refers to Egypt's western neighbors, the Libyans, who decorated their long hair with such feathers. It's unclear whether Amentet was considered merely an aspect of Hathor or was her subordinate. A little known but fascinating aspect of Hathor is her role as patroness of Egyptians traveling abroad, including soldiers and traders. As Lady of the Port, she was a patroness of boats and shipping. She escorted mining expeditions, particularly to Sinai, but also further north. She patronized trade expeditions to the Phoenician cities as Mistress of Byblos, Mistress of Foreign Lands, and the goddess of distant places. It's worth mentioning that the city of Byblos, located in today's Lebanon, was practically an Egyptian city, even in the times of the Middle Kingdom. It was an Egyptian colony, a trading point used by them probably from early dynastic times, and from where they imported the much-needed Lebanese cedars. Egypt's ancient connection with Byblos is emphasized by the famous myth in which Osiris, betrayed by Seth, drifts locked in a sarcophagus through the mouth of the Nile to this distant city. Of course, since ancient times, the Egyptians have been exploring the Asian part of modern Egypt, the then hard-to-reach Sinai Peninsula, rich in natural resources, such as turquoise, which was particularly desirable at the Nile River, and was mined in the Sinai already by the first ruler of the 4th dynasty, Snefru, in the 26th century BC. Used to make expensive jewelry, turquoise was dedicated to Hathor, titled Lady of Turquoise. Sometimes she was even depicted with a blue-green complexion. It's no wonder that she was the patroness of the mines in Sinai, where we can still admire the ruins of her temple in Serabit el-Kadim, discovered by Flinders Petrie at the beginning of the 20th century. Interestingly, Hathor shrines built by turquoise and copper prospectors have also been found on the eastern shores of the Red Sea. She was worshipped there by both the Egyptians and the Midianites, a mysterious people identified by some scholars with the Shasu nomads who worshipped Yahweh as their god. The cult of Hathor certainly resonated with Egypt's Asian neighbors. The Canaanites and the Phoenicians identified her with Astarte, and the Assyrians and the Babylonians with Ishtar. Hathor was a patroness of not only the northern frontiers of the empire, but also the southern, distant lands. As a Lady of Punt, she protected trade missions to a mysterious country, the location of which hasn't yet been determined. It's generally indicated as a land south of Nubia, somewhere on the southern coast of the Red Sea. Proposed locations include Somalia, Ethiopia, and Arabia. Already in the age of the pyramids, trade contacts were maintained with Punt, bringing from their essential oils, incense, and other scents for cult purposes, as well as exotic plants, decorating temple gardens in Egypt. Probably that's why Punt was referred to as God's land or Holy Land. Or perhaps it was simply about encouraging sailors to such a dangerous expedition into the unknown. As is commonly known, Egyptian women took special care of their physical attractiveness. Makeup, wigs, and jewelry were indispensable. Young girls wearing skimpy or transparent dresses willingly revealed most parts of their bodies, often tattooed. In this culture, there was permissive approach unheard of in others. Young Egyptian women were taught, apart from singing and dancing, the art of seduction. Most of the girls, however, came from a low-class background. From an early age, they were encouraged by their parents to do various household chores and work in the field or crafts. As the father of history Herodotus noted in the 5th century BC, writing about Egyptian customs that he found strange. Quote, "The women attend the markets and trade, while the men sit at home at the loom." So they were very busy, probably dreaming of breaking away from parental control. To find a future husband and to be able to seduce him, they turned to the divine protectors of lovers, such as the cat-headed Bastet, but above all to Hathor, the lady of love and beauty, the patroness of lovers. The romantic nature of the Egyptians is brilliantly reflected in love poetry. Preserved fragments from the so-called Chester BT1 papyrus from the Ramessid period contain lovers' requests to Hathor, the Golden One. I pass by his house, finding its door open. My beloved stands beside his mother, his siblings all around him. He looks at me as I pass, but I alone rejoice. Had his mother known my heart, she would have gone inside for a moment. O Golden One, put that in her heart, so I may hurry to my beloved and kiss him before his companions. And here's another poem. My beloved stirs my heart with his voice, he causes illness to seize me. My mother is right in commanding me, avoid seeing him. But my heart is smitten by his memory, my love for him has seized me. Look, he's a fool, but I am just like him. He does not know my desire to embrace him. He does not send word to my mother. Oh, my beloved, I am destined for you by the golden goddess of women. Of course, it wasn't only women who turned to the patroness of lovers. The area around her largest sanctuary in Thebes, Jazar Jazaru in Deir el-Bahri, was literally covered in wooden and stone phallic votives. Worshippers of Hathor counted on her help in restoring sexual prowess or conceiving a desired child. Since the New Kingdom, it was extremely popular to make votive offerings to the goddess in the form of faience or wooden tablets containing inscriptions and representing the ears of the goddess listening to prayers, and above all, small figurines of females, cows, cats, and scarabs, as well as jewelry and clothing. Egyptians offered Hathor textiles in the hope that she would clothe them in the afterlife, as religious funeral texts promised. Particularly large accumulations of votive offerings are found not in temples where the average Egyptian had no access, but in places where small chapels once stood, auxiliary sanctuaries open to the faithful, usually situated in the immediate vicinity of the temple. According to archaeologists, the offerings given to Hathor were mostly related to pregnancy and childbirth. The special protection of the Divine Mother was also provided by tattooed symbols of Hathor. Only women were tattooed, usually on parts of the body related to childbirth, such as the belly, lower abdomen, thighs, and breasts. Tattoos seem to be closely connected with Hathor's spirituality and were attributes of her priestesses, dancers, and midwives. The conservative Egyptian society prided itself on its peaceful life in a stable and hierarchical world. The determination of a person's social position at birth, as well as the determination of the length of life and even the cause of death, was the responsibility of specialized deities called by the ancients 7 Hathors. It was believed that these goddesses, invisible musicians, visited newborns and announced their fate. It was believed that their voices could be sometimes heard by the child's father or midwives. Hathor, the guardian of ordinary simple people, accompanied them from the moment of birth. She carefully led them through a good life to then take care of them after death. The Egyptians loved their compassionate goddess sincerely and participated in her festivals in large numbers, and she had several of them. The best attested in ancient sources New Year's festival is the one held in the temple of Hathor in Dendera. Dendera, or Yunad as the ancient Egyptians called it, is located just 5 kilometers south of modern Kina. This is the place where probably the best preserved monument of ancient Egypt stands to this day, the beautiful Ptolemaic temple of Hathor. It was a great religious center for thousands of years, the main sanctuary of the Mistress of the sky. According to archaeologists, its area was used already in pre-dynastic times, and the inscriptions of the temple seems to confirm this. On the night preceding the first day of the Nile flood, just before dawn, a procession of priests would carry the cult statue of the goddess to the roof of the temple, where it would await the first rays of the sun. I once had the opportunity to find myself on that roof, where I saw a beautiful kiosk built especially for this purpose. When the rising sun illuminated the statue, it was believed that Ra united with the goddess, giving her strength for the entire coming year. This was the beginning of the celebrations, during which crowds of pilgrims showed their joy by dancing and feasting to the sounds of music. The attendance was always good. Such festivals were the only opportunity for ordinary people to take an active part in religious life and to see the goddess, or rather her cult statue, with their own eyes. On the 20th day of the first month of the flood season, crowds of pilgrims from all over the country flocked to Dendera to celebrate the mythical salvation of humanity from divine retribution. The joyful atmosphere of the singing and dancing crowd of pilgrims is reflected in the hymn to the Lady of the Dance, inscribed on the temple walls. We beat the rhythm for your ka, we dance for your majesty, we exalt you to the height of the sky. You are the Lady of Sistra, Mistress of Menit and Sistrum, Lady of music played for her ka. We adore your majesty, daily from dusk to dawn. We play the tambourine before you, Mistress in Dendera. With hymns, you are the Lady of Exultation, Mistress of Dance, Lady of Music, Mistress of Music and Lady of Ballet, Mistress who attaches the wreath, Lady of Myrrh, Mistress of Acrobatic Dance. Reading ancient texts, I get the impression that the ancient Egyptians were an extremely entertaining people. Music, singing and dancing, loud, tipsy crowds, partying from dusk till dawn. All of this fun was under the patronage of Hathor, the Lady of Joy, the Mistress of Music, the one who makes beer. The theology of Dendera emphasized Hathor's special role among the gods, but they didn't have to do anything special. Hathor was the most important of the Egyptian goddesses. This is beautifully illustrated by the hymn inscribed on the wall of her sanctuary. Hail to you, female sovereign in the horizon, lady to the limit, female ruler of the Ennead. Praise to you within the palace, noble lady and mistress of the noble ladies. The gods and men praise you, the goddesses and women adore you. How beautiful is your face in the Perwer sanctuary. Ra rejoices being near you, the sky and the stars rejoice for you. The sun and the moon adore you. The souls of Pe and the souls of Nekhen are making jubilation for your ka. Thoth the Great is praising your incarnation. The Ennead of Ra is paying homage to your ka, who are the gods who come into being in the noon. The lords of the sanctuaries are paying homage to your name. Everyone is possessing dread of you, Hathor. I hope you learned something new about the beliefs of ancient Egyptians. Thank you for listening. Please let me know in the comments what you would like to hear about next time. I would also like to thank all my patrons. I truly appreciate your contribution. Thank you. If you don't support me yet, but would like to, I placed my Patreon link below in the description. Don't forget to like my video and subscribe to my channel. Goodbye and see you on the next one.